was a commercial artist who used this technique to win the goodwill of a petulant, scolding buyer of art. You give them the leeway to do what they know is right without necessarily forcing them to do it, which is really, 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 really powerful. He has this other student, Bruce Harvey, and he had incorrectly authorized payment of full wages to an employee on sick leave. And when he discovered the error, he brought it to the attention of his boss, right? And so he goes up to his boss, he walks into this office, and he says, look, man, I made a mistake. We got this guy over here, he's on sick leave, and I gave him full pay from the registrar, and he's getting all his money. And he's like, dude, I don't know what to tell you. He made this mistake, and he said, like, look, here are all the facts. This is everything that happened. And he replied in an explosive manner that it was his fault. And then this manager guy, he said, no, it's not your fault. It's the personnel department's fault. And he says, no, you cannot blame somebody else. This is all on me. And he exploded again about how this was careless. It was his fault. And he explained that it was his fault. And then the supervisor said, no, not your fault. It's somebody else's fault. He explained, this is totally, supervisor should have given you approval, and this is just not your fault. And what's cool is, like, as he walked into this office, this employee basically was expecting his boss to explode. And so as he used this strategy of saying, look, it's my fault, and he came in ingeniously realizing that the only way to come out of the situation on the positive, in the green, being accepted as himself, was to criticize himself, which is exactly what he did. His boss, he tried to blame 2 other people, but every single time, all he did was reiterate that it was his fault, all his fault, and 100% is on him that this mistake happened. He just kept sticking to his guns. And then finally his boss looked at him and he said, okay, you know what? It's your fault. Now straighten it out. And the error was corrected and nobody got into trouble. And it felt amazing because he was able to handle a tense situation and had the courage not to seek an alibi. And his bosses have more respect for him ever since because he freaking took responsibility. There was no punishment. There was no harm done. There was no life-changing to get fired. Because in reality, most problems are just little challenges to overcome, and it doesn't really matter. You just need to take responsibility, or it becomes a much greater challenge. If you don't take responsibility, you're gonna have a big problem. If you take sole and complete and entire responsibility for something, it's probably just gonna fade away, not a big deal. You look at people, and I'm not saying this for crime, because crime it's a very different game. But think about this idea of somebody who says they're running not guilty for a robbery versus somebody who runs, guilty. It's like, yeah, I did it, I'm sorry, who do you think is gonna get an easier punishment? It's the person who raises their hand and says, look, this is my fault, entirely my fault, it's the worst ever. I mean, they might get half, or they might even not have a sentence. It just depends. This is more for the workplace, it's more for your relationships, and it's more for overcoming challenges when they arise. But I want you guys to understand, sort of look at how this is applied in so many different industries, because it all stems around this one key concept of saying you're wrong and admitting it before the other person. Any fool can try to defend his or her mistake, and most fools do, but the ones who rise above the herd and give one a feeling of nobility and exaltation to admit one's own mistake prosper. For example, one of those beautiful things that history records about Robert E. Lee is the way he blamed himself and only himself for the failure of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. He has this whole army of people, and his charge was so ingenious. It was undoubtedly one of the most brilliant attacks that ever occurred in the Western world. And General Pickett himself was just, oh my gosh, he wore his hair so long, and he was just like a Napoleon in his Italian campaigns, who wrote love letters almost daily on the battlefield. And he devoted troops, cheered almost daily, every single time, because for him, they were part of a group, they were part of a family, they were part of a connection. Everybody was fighting alongside each other. And then there was one tragic July afternoon as he rode off jauntily towards the Union lines, that his cap sat at a rakish angle over his right ear. And they cheered and they followed him, man touching man, rank pressing rank, with banners flying and bayonets gleaming in the sun. It was a galleon sign, magnificent, daring, and a murmur of admiration ran through the Union lines as they beheld it. And then Pickett's troops swept forward at an easy trot through orchard and cornfield, across a meadow and over a ravine. All the time the enemy's cannon was tearing ghastly holes in their rank, literally cutting through the men. But they pressed grim and irresistible. And then suddenly the Union infantry rose from behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, where they'd been hiding, and fired a volley after volley into Pickett's troops. The crest of the hill was a sheet of flame, a slaughterhouse, a blazing volcano. If you want to picture what this looked like, you got tons and tons and tons of these men charging all together towards this brutal force of people that are just trying to kill them with cannons and guns. And then halfway through this charge, they create a little L setup, and these guys pop out over here. Now they're being attacked on both fronts. Everyone popping out, just trying to slaughter. Literally every single shot they have is going right towards the slaughterhouse, a blazing volcano. And in a few minutes, all of Pickett's brigade commanders except one were down, and 4/5 of his 5,000 men had died. It's pretty harsh. General Lewis Armistead, instead of leading the troops into the final plunge, ran forward, vaulted over the stone wall, and waving his hand and his cap on the top of his sword, he shouted, "Give him the steel, boys." And they did. They leaped over the wall, they bayoneted their enemy, smashed their skulls with clubbed muskets, and planted the battlefield flags of the South on Cemetery Ridge. The banners waved there only for a moment, but at that moment, brief as it was, the record high water mark of the Confederacy was recorded. And Pickett's charge, brilliant and heroic, as much as he tried, it was nevertheless the beginning of the end. Lee had failed. He could not penetrate the North, and he knew it. Everyone had just been devastated. The South was doomed. Lee was so sad and so shocked that he sent his resignation in and asked Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, to appoint a younger, abler man. As Lee takes in this defeat, and he has literally thousands of people die under him, he could have easily blamed the disastrous failure of Pickett's charge on someone else. He could have found a score of alibis. Some of his division commanders had failed him, his cavalry hadn't arrived in time to support the infantry. This had gone wrong, and it had gone wrong array. But Lee was too noble to blame others. As Pickett's beaten and bloody troops struggled back to the Confederate lines, Robert Lee rode out to meet them all and greeted them with a self-condemnation that was little short of sublime. He said, "All this has been my fault," he confessed, and I alone have lost this battle. There are literally thousands of people that fought in this, but he takes full and complete responsibility for the outcome because he is the leader. He's the one that is the sole responsibility of success. Like, if an organization fails, or if a company fails, or if a team fails, it's not just the people's fault that participated. More than anything else, it's the leader's fault. If a Fortune 500 seat company goes bankrupt, it's not the minimum wage employee's fault. It's the CEO. The leader must take responsibility, and they are leaders because they take responsibility. Who do you think signs every single annual report from a company? It's the freaking CEO, chairman, whatever. Few generals in all of history have had the courage and character to admit that. Michael Chung, who teaches Carnegie's course in Hong Kong, told of how the Chinese culture presents some special problems and how sometimes it is necessary to recognize that the benefit of applying a principle may be more advantageous than maintaining an old tradition. And he had one middle-aged class member who had an opium addiction. But he was now cured. And in Chinese tradition, an older person cannot take the first step. So the father felt that it was up to his son to take the initiative toward a reconciliation. And early into the session, he told the class about all the grandchildren he had never seen and how much he desired to be reunited with his son. Because his classmates, who were all Chinese, understood his conflict between his desire and long-established tradition. He was torn between what he knew was right and what he was just driven so innately by his internal drive to do. And it was a very, very, very tough separation, right? And the father felt that young people should have respect for their elders, and that he was right in not giving in to his desire, but to wait for his son to come to him. And towards the end of the course, the father again addressed the class and said, "I have pondered over this problem." He said, Dale Carnegie says, "If you are wrong, admit it quickly and empathetically. It is too late for me to admit it quickly, but I can admit it empathetically." Empathetically. I wronged my son. He was right in not wanting to see me and to expel me from his life. I may lose face, he may lose face by asking a younger person's forgiveness, but he was at fault, and it was his relationship, his responsibility to admit this. And the class applauded him and gave him their full support. At the next class, he told them about how he went to his son's house, and he asked for and received forgiveness, and they started building up this relationship again. He took the temporary pain of asking for forgiveness, raising his hand and saying help, for that long-term gain of having a real relationship with his son. Just so powerful. And that's something that will literally last for the rest of his life. And now he's connected with his daughter-in-law, his grandkids. He finally got to meet them, and it was just an amazing experience because he freaking said he was wrong. Albert Hubbard was one of the most original authors who ever stirred up a nation, and his stinging sentences often aroused fierce resentment. But Hubbard, with his rare skill for handling people, frequently turned his enemies into friends. For example, when some irritated reader wrote in to say that he didn't agree with such and such about an article and ended by calling Hubbard this and that, Albert Hubbard would answer like this, and this is a really powerful response. It's probably one of the best responses that you can have to somebody. It says, "Come to think it over, I don't entirely agree with it myself. Not everything I wrote yesterday appeals to me today. I am glad to learn what you think on the subject. The next time you are in the neighborhood, you must visit and we'll get the subject threshed out for all time. So here is your hand clasp over the miles, and I am yours sincerely, Albert Hubbard." Like, imagine this. Imagine somebody insulting you, somebody saying that you did something wrong and saying that you're bad and blah, and they're like literally attacking you in your positions. And you say, "Thank you! I don't agree with it either. Not everything I wrote appeals to me. I am glad to learn what you think on the subject. The next time you're in the neighborhood, you must come over so we can get it worked out." How much do you think that will help the other person? If I write you an angry letter and say, "Oh my gosh, your mistake, it was awful, you're the worst ever," and you say, "Thank you, I agree with you," that's gonna build so much rapport. For those of you guys who want to copy this little paragraph phrase, which is so powerful, just get it. It's on 133, and it's insane. What could you say to a man who treats you like that when you are right? When we are right, let's try to win people gently and tactfully to our way of thinking. And when we are wrong, and that will be surprisingly often, if we are honest with ourselves, let's admit our mistakes and admit them with enthusiasm. Not only will that technique produce astonishing results, but believe it or not, it's a lot more fun. It's so much more fun to criticize yourself and say, "I can't believe I did all these silly things that were wrong," than it is to try to defend yourself against other people's criticism. Remember the old proverb, by fighting, you never get enough, but by yielding, you get more than you expect. That's the key. And that's really the core of this principle, this idea that if you're wrong, you want to admit it quickly and empathetically, and you'll win over so many people. So that's the goal, that's the strat, and that is really the powerful concept that you get from this section here. So hope you guys got a ton of value from this. Go out there, apply it, absolutely crush it, and I will see you in the next module. Thank you. Bye.